You developed a sixth sense on this island. Once out on a patrol, we needed to keep our senses alert and trust our instincts. If something didn't look right or feel right, even when I couldn't say exactly why it wasn't right, I knew we'd better not move into that suspicious area. Sometimes I couldn't say why it was suspicious, but my instincts told me something was wrong. That sixth sense was telling me that a couple of Japanese were hiding in the underbrush just ahead, and they were watching our every move. Once it worked the other way around, and we found ourselves watching one of them. On this particular day, I was out with just my squad, and we approached the Matanikau by following a route a little farther inland and away from the beach. As we neared the riverbank, there was an open grassy area of maybe 100 yards or more that went straight to the river. The grass wasn't tall at this point, and we had a clear view to the river. Among the island's native animal life were caribou, which, before the war, I believe the native Melanesians tended as cattle. By the time we were on the canal, the caribou were all running wild. On this day, we stopped as we approached the grassy stretch to the river, and in the distance we saw 3 of those caribou. Our presence must have startled them, because they began to move away. The odd thing about it was that 2 of the caribou moved off in one direction, and the third moved off in another, toward the safety of jungle underbrush. My point man motioned to me and I joined him. "Look at that caribou," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Something's wrong with him." I couldn't tell exactly what it was, though. We watched the animal more closely, and finally I saw what was wrong. "Damn it!" I said. "That caribou's got 6 legs." "Well, I'll be damned," somebody else said. Those 2 extra legs belonged to a lone Japanese who was hanging onto the animal, running with it and keeping himself behind it, where he hoped we couldn't see him. We just watched that 6-legged caribou run off to safety. We were too far away from our MLR, and we didn't want to start a firefight any more than he did. So this time we just let the Japanese soldier and his caribou cover run off to safety. He probably thought he had been pretty clever. Everybody was concerned about the food problem, from command all the way down to the lowliest private on the line. Those 2 tablespoons of Japanese rice, seasoned with plump maggots and served twice a day, just weren't enough to sustain the men. Looking back on the situation now, I marvel at how, despite the adversity and deprivation, our morale never hit rock bottom. It was only our supplies that sank that low. I was in the defence line that extended along the beach, west of Lunga Point, and then swung inland at a 45-degree angle through a coconut grove and up to the top of a ridge. The beach was our platoon's secondary defence position, our primary position being the MLR's western perimeter as it swung inland across the Copra Road and through a coconut grove. L Company's other platoons extended the MLR farther inland and up on the ridge. On this particular morning, we were at our secondary position, guarding the beach. The night had been quiet, but lo and behold, as we looked out to sea at first light, one of our own destroyers sat anchored and motionless not more than 700 yards offshore. It must have arrived quietly during the night, then dropped anchor, unobserved by all on shore. Nobody on the ship was topside. The destroyer sat outlined against the sky and looked as peaceful as a car parked in a driveway back home. It was the first US ship we'd seen in a couple of weeks, and it was a welcome sight. Yogi Milana and I were sitting in the sand and talking about it with another squad leader from our platoon, Sia Plabel Hank Klimicki. Before Pearl Harbor, Yogi, better known to his parents and to our company clerk as PFC, Richard E. Milana, had been a student at Brooklyn College, where he was on the swimming team. Rumour around L Company had it that he also did yoga meditations and exercises, which was how he got his nickname. Yogi has a different explanation for his name and insists to this day that it's only the guys in L.3.5 who call him Yogi. Everyone else calls him Dick or Richard, but to us he was and is Yogi. "Somebody's got to be aboard," Yogi remarked. "I can smell breakfast." Damn, so could I. More guys in my squad heard the magic word and came over to join the discussion. "Breakfast?" Hank said. "Yeah, just smell that delicious aroma." We could all smell it, and it was wonderful. The aroma of cooking breakfast drifted ashore on a light breeze, Coffee and bacon and all those other kitchen fragrances that smelled like home. It almost drove us nuts. There were about a half dozen of us by now, up on our feet and gazing with longing at the destroyer. We talked about all that wonderful food we were smelling, telling each other we wished we were aboard, sitting at a table and eating just one decent meal. Living on starvation rations, and most of us sick with tropical illnesses, we were all losing weight. By the time we finally left the canal, we'd each lost between 20 and 30 pounds. But on that particular morning, I don't think any of us truly realized how hungry we always were, not until we smelled that good old stateside chow being cooked. Yogi came up with a bright idea. What if I swim out there and get us some chow? Oh yeah! Keep on dreaming! Why don't you flap your arms and fly out there? Some of the men started taunting. Wait a minute, I said. I was a squad leader, so maybe my opinion carried a little extra weight. Or maybe I just yelled louder than the others. Wait a minute! Yogi's a good swimmer. He was on a college swimming team, for Christ's sake. Yeah? Suddenly the guys shut up and looked admiringly at Yogi. Is that the truth, Yogi? Sure, it's the truth. You think Marion makes up stories? Yeah, somebody said. I know he does. Shut up, I said. I'm not making this one up. Hope began lighting up their faces. We all agreed that Yogi had just come up with one great idea. One of the guys started flapping his arms and waving at the ship. Some of the sailors must have been watching us from the bridge, because before long one of them appeared outside on the wing bridge. He began waving back. In those days, every man in the Navy and Marines had to learn semaphore, and on this occasion the knowledge came in handy. Our guy who had been waving began signalling in semaphore. Will you give us some chow? The sailor on the wing bridge signalled back. Yes, but how? Someone will swim out to the ship. While the semaphore messages were going back and forth, Yogi had sat down in the sand and assumed what looked to me like a yoga meditation position. Maybe he was only trying to muster up enough strength to make the long swim, but to the rest of us it looked like a yoga position. Hey, look at Yogi, one of our guys remarked, amazed. He's doing yoga. What the hell's yoga? Another guy asked. Back in those days, most Americans didn't know much about yoga. Never mind, I said. Just let him do it. Meanwhile, we started making plans. Yogi would swim out to the ship while two of us on the beach covered him for sharks with our 0.3 rifles. When we spotted Yogi coming back, Hank would swim out, meet him halfway, and assist in getting that precious chow ashore. Somebody mentioned that we were breaking a few rules. To hell with rules, regulations, and everything else, one of the guys said. Damn right! All's fair in love and war, somebody else said. That made sense to me. We were definitely at war. We were in love with the idea of getting some decent food for a change, and we were hungry as hell. And the sailors out on the destroyer were willing to give us some chow. Yogi had peeled down to his skin. He was up on his feet, then into the water. Within seconds, only his head and shoulders were visible. Soon we could see just his head and thrashing arms. Yogi was making good progress, and we were getting excited. We watched until he was so far out that we weren't always able to spot his head on the water's surface. 15 minutes passed, maybe 20. Then we saw sailors moving around on the ship's deck, reaching down. Next we saw Yogi. Sailors were pulling him aboard, and there was no mistaking him, his hair long and wet and gleaming pitch black in the early morning sunlight. In the battle zone, we didn't have the luxury of a barber's chair, and we all looked pretty scruffy. We watched the sailors help Yogi on deck. Then they all disappeared into a passageway. He was out of sight, but safe. We cheered and yelled. Then we sat back down on the sand and waited, which was the only thing left for us to do. Jesus, he's probably eating bacon and eggs, Hank said. Or maybe ham, I said. Somebody else moaned. He must have been picturing the food we were talking about and longing for some of it. I wonder what kind of food they'll give him to bring ashore, Hank said. Nobody answered, but we each had ideas of our own. Anything but rice, I thought. We waited, and we waited some more. It was almost too much for us to bear. Meanwhile, none of the other Marines on the canal had the faintest idea what our guys were doing or why we were doing it. And nobody above the rank of squad leader, and that included only Hank and me, gave a damn. Another 20 minutes passed without any visible sign of activity on the destroyer. Then several figures appeared topside, a couple of sailors and Yogi. He wasted no time climbing down the ship's net, while the sailors began lowering an object into the water near him. From our distance, we couldn't make out what the object was, but we figured it had to contain food. Yogi was in the water now, the sailors looking down at him from the deck, watching him start to swim away. We were watching too, but from our distance, all we could make out was that object floating in the water. Then it did more than just bob on the surface. It started coming toward us and was making good progress. That meant Yogi was pushing it ahead of him as he swam towards shore. "Wish me luck!" Hank shouted, then dashed into the water and began swimming toward Yogi. He was on his way to help bring in the cargo. They met about halfway out, and together now they towed their cargo toward shore. By this time, the floating object was close enough for us to make it out. The sailors had rigged up a small wooden raft, about 3 feet square, and had lashed a supply of canned food on it. Yogi and Hank touched bottom and were splashing ashore, carrying their treasure between them. We ran down to meet them, yelling, and for a change, having something worth cheering about. It wasn't yet 0700 hours, but on this unusual morning, several Marines from Company L.3 had themselves one hell of a good breakfast. My most vivid memory is of sitting in the sand and opening one of the cans, then taking beautiful, luscious yellow peach halves out of the sweet syrup. Damn, but they tasted good. Yogi had already eaten breakfast back aboard the destroyer, but he never did tell us what he'd had. That's all right. Whatever it was, he'd earned it. To this day, I doubt that our company commander, our platoon leader, our first sergeant, or our platoon sergeant ever found out about our special breakfast that day. If any of them read this, they'll know now. Meanwhile, I wonder about the crew on the destroyer, and if any of them have ever told the story or ever written about the crazy Marine swimmer who boarded their ship to scrounge breakfast for some of the troops back on the beach. I'd like to hear their version of the story. Anyhow, after all these years, I do owe them one thing. Thanks a lot, guys. You made our misery and hunger a little easier to bear. Late on the evening of September 12, 1942, the Japanese command on Guadalcanal started a well-coordinated land-sea-air attack on the Marine-held perimeter. The ground attacks concentrated on 3 main points. The enemy went against our eastern perimeter, which was defended by the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. The Japanese also thrust northward at our southern perimeter in what became their main assault. That was the now famous Battle of Bloody Ridge. The 3rd point they attacked during the battle was our western perimeter, defended by my own L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Frederick C. Bebush. The main thrust at Bloody Ridge lasted from September 12th through 14. It has been written about and studied many times over, and is regarded by most historians as the critical turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. If the Japanese had been able to take Bloody Ridge, Vandergrift's command post and Henderson Field itself would have fallen, and Guadalcanal probably would have been lost. As the official battle histories tell us, the Marines under Colonel Merritt A. Edson held Bloody Ridge and saved both the airfield and the command post. Meanwhile, a lesser-known chapter of that battle took place on the western perimeter, where we did our own share of fighting. L.3 held a line west of the Longa River, about 5,000 to 6,000 yards west of Bloody Ridge. Our own main line of resistance, or MLR, would look like a shallow bow shape on a map, beginning at the beach's berm line, extending across maybe 30 yards of sand beach to a dirt trail that we called the Copra Cart Road, then crossing the road and stretching through a little more than 100 yards of grass and coconut grove. Beyond the coconut palms, our MLR went uphill for another 100 or so yards on hard coral to a V-shaped ridge that I'll be calling L Company Ridge. I believe some Japanese maps designated it Tora Ridge. The ridge itself was coral, and so hard that the men who held it couldn't dig in. In all, we were 3 platoons strong. My own 1st platoon, led by Lieutenant John Flash Flaherty, commanded the Coconut Grove and the Copra Cart Road, which led westward, parallel with the beach, toward the Matanikau River. Somewhere down at the other end of that road was a large unit of Japanese combat troops. In fact, if you went down to the shoreline and looked toward Matanikau, you could see a beached Japanese landing craft in the distance. Inland, holding the opposite end of L Company's part of the MLR from where my platoon was positioned, 2nd Lieutenant Edward Farmer's 3rd Platoon held L Company Ridge, our defence line's all-important high ground. My platoon's position started from the beach, straddled the road, and went into the grove. Dug in on the side of the road nearer the beach, we had a 37mm gun that came from Regimental Company. We had the gun dug in so deep that only its barrel was above ground level. At the road's other side, we had a water-cooled 30-caliber heavy machine gun from M Company. Also along our line, we had several light 30-caliber machine guns and at least 5 BRs, plus riflemen positioned between the automatic weapons. L Company's platoons were short-manned, but in the Coconut Grove we were well dug in, well spaced, and camouflaged with care. Lieutenant Farmer's platoon was less well protected. Their problem was the ridge's solid coral rock. It was so hard that it was impossible for the defenders to dig in with any of the equipment we had on hand. Being out in the open put them at a clear disadvantage, but that ridge had to be manned, and it had to be held. Far off on our left flank, the Japanese were already attacking Bloody Ridge. Our own sector remained quiet, but that wouldn't last long. One of my old cobber friends, Art Boston, was up on the ridge with Farmer's 3rd Platoon. Here's how he recalls the night of September 13th, 14. Our job was to defend the ridge near the new fighter airfield, and from there down to the beach. We had to stop any enemy coming through that line. One night we'd just gotten through unloading barrels of gasoline for our fighter planes, and we were tired. We went back and took the positions that we held every night, and we weren't expecting any kind of attack on our part of the line. But when we were up on our ridge, pretty tired, word was passed to us that we were having a 50% alert. In other words, with 2 men in a foxhole, one of us would have to be awake at all times. Although L Company's section of the MLR had remained quiet to this point, we'd been hearing plenty of fireworks in the distance as the Japanese were making their main thrust at Bloody Ridge. Our orders were to hold fast at the far western sector of the MLR and await a Japanese attack from the west. Art Boston's recollection of that night continues. On the first watch, I was sitting up with Smitty, per Sir Milton H. Smith, because I couldn't sleep, and I put little pebbles in the ration cans, and we hung them on the barbed wire so that if anybody or anything hit the wire, it would give a little tinkle-tinkle. Well, the wire started tinkling. I said, "Smitty, I'm going to fire 3 rounds down there and see if I can get anything stirred up." So I fired 3 rounds, and I stirred something up all right. Our lieutenant. Lieutenant Farmer came running up to the top of the ridge and said, "Did you fire those 3 shots, Boston?" I said, "Yes, sir. There are Japanese down there. I can smell 'em." "What do you mean you can smell them?" I said, "It's not a body odour or anything like that. It's just, I don't know what it is, but I know it's them." "Look," he said, "don't do any more shooting. The guys are getting all upset." I said, "I want them to be upset, because if there's Japanese out there, they could come through here at any time." Lieutenant Farmer went back down, and pretty soon I heard the tinkling again. I took another shot, and the lieutenant came back up. "Boston, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. You're directly disobeying an order in a combat zone." I said, "Well, sir, I won't do that again." He said okay and left us, and it wasn't much later when I heard quite a bit of rustling out there, down the ridge from our defence line. I looked at Smitty and I said, "Smitty, he didn't say anything about grenades, did he?" Smitty said, "No, he didn't." So I pulled the pin on one and gave it a good heave. It went off, and after that there was no more tinkling on the barbed wire. I think Lieutenant Farmer began to realise from reports somewhere else down our line that our boys were hearing movements out there. He didn't make an issue about the grenade. He just came around and told us, "Keep alert and knock off the firing. Next time you hear anything and you think it's Japanese, one of you come down and report it." Well, I had the 12 o'clock to dawn watch that night, and I hate to admit it, but I did something that I could have gotten shot for. Sometime shortly before dawn, I just fell asleep, and when I woke up, my watch said 5:30. I just said, "Oh my goodness." Smitty was sleeping because it was his time to sleep, but he woke up soon after that. I pulled out my cigarettes and offered him one. He said no and stuffed his Red Man tobacco into his cheek. He loved that chewing tobacco. So I lit my cigarette and I leaned back to take it easy, which is when I heard this wicked screeching, "Ah, Malines, you die! Ah, Malines, you die!" It was like a sing-song chant. Now our whole line was wide awake. We were in position, and we all knew what was coming. Sure enough, the Japanese hit the barbed wire, and they were stopped right there. Firing opened up on both sides. Our Browning automatics and our machine guns started firing, not to mention our .30, 03 rifles, all of us firing. My rifle got so hot that as soon as I got a round in the chamber, it would go off before I could pull the trigger. While Boston and his platoon were up on the ridge, we were down in the coconut grove. When the attack began in our section that early morning of September 14th, it was still dark, less than an hour before sunrise. We heard the Japanese approaching when they were still 150 yards from our defense line. That gave us time to get ready. We had no way of knowing their strength, but I read years later that they were 3 of Colonel Oker's companies. The main body of that force came up the old Copra Cart Road. My platoon was waiting for them in the palm grove, and now we were starting to see them. In that early morning darkness, pale moonlight peeking through the palm trees gave us a clear view of the approaching columns. The Japanese were rattling equipment, bullshitting, joking, not making any effort to be cautious. Their equipment was reflecting glints of moonlight. We could see clearly that each column was led by an officer who wielded a sabre, and their sabres shimmered and flashed in the moonlight too. Those carefree champions were coming in to attack us in a close-order route march, approaching our line in columns of 3. Either they didn't realize how near we were to them, or they were too dumb and too arrogant to give a damn. Word was passed up and down our line. "Hold your fire until our 37mm lets go." In previous campaigns, those Japanese were used to seeing their opponents pick up and run away from them as soon as they came into sight. Their enemies had panicked on a number of occasions on the Asian mainland in China, Malay, Singapore, and Burma. This was the first time the Japanese had ever come up against an outfit that refused to pick up and run. I should add that this outfit, my outfit, had nowhere to get up and run to. So the only thing we could do was fight. Oker's troops were about to meet their match. The Japanese main assault group, still in formation, approached to about 25 yards from our line when the 37mm let fly with the first of a dozen or so canister or grape-shot rounds. Blam! Our whole line followed suit, opening up with all weapons. Machine guns and bars swept their lanes of fire. Riflemen took targets, picking off Japanese who were trying to get away. The Japanese sent very little return fire in our direction. They never got the chance. For the Japanese on the road and in the coconut grove, it was all over in less than 10 minutes. Our company's First Sergeant William McMullen was among our own wounded in the coconut grove. He was one hell of a nice guy, but he was evacuated and I never saw him again. Platoon Sergeant Ben B. Selvitel, a good friend of mine, took McMullen's place as First Sergeant, becoming the youngest First Sergeant in the entire division. The L.35 casualties in that sector of our defence line were extremely light, but the story was different at the top of L Company Ridge, the sector that Art Boston held. The Marines holding that position were in serious trouble several times over the next 24 hours, and I experienced it firsthand because later that day I became one of them. Our battle in the coconut grove was all but over, but we were still hearing plenty of gunfire up on the ridge, where farmers' men were maintaining their positions without the benefit of cover. Their only defence was primitive but effective, the couple strands of barbed wire and the ration cans with pebbles in them. Whenever an approaching enemy touched that wire, the stones would rattle like hell and give him away. The third Japanese column approached Farmers Ridge positions the same way that their other columns had come into our coconut grove, in a close-order route march, talking among themselves, their equipment rattling. Several bars and the riflemen on the ridge opened fire on them before they could reorganize and attempt an attack. Even though our defense positions up there were mostly above ground because of the ridge's hard coral, the men in Farmer's platoon held their ground, and not one of them let up fighting until he was wounded to the point of being unable to continue without medical attention. The Japanese reorganized and attacked our ridge again. By now we were fighting in broad daylight. Every time they tried to sneak up through the jungle growth to the open crest of L Company Ridge, the cans rattled and our guys opened up with their bars and .30 caliber Springfields. But the Japanese gave back plenty of return fire too. At the V point on the ridgeline, about a half-dozen wounded L-35 Marines were forced by a Japanese attack to withdraw about 10 yards. They formed a new position a little way back down the ridge, at the military crest of the ridge. Holding their position at that point, they never, and I mean absolutely never, withdrew another step until the Japanese assault terminated in failure hours later. Art Boston puts it like this: when you're in combat, and you've got a certain area that you've got to look after, you're oblivious to everything else going on around you in other areas. That's how it was with us during that fight. At that same time, Colonel Edson and his Raider Battalion were taking an awful lot of fire down the line on Bloody Ridge. They could have lost the whole thing, but they kept their position, and it was just by sheer, I don't know what you'd call it, determination maybe. They would not give in to the superior force of Japanese that was hitting them. They suffered pretty high casualties, and we suffered casualties on our own ridge. And it just shows how much a person can stand at a time like that. We were taking a good beating up on our ridge, and down on the beach there was shooting left and right, where the other L Company platoons were stopping a Japanese advance. We had a brave bunch of kids that night, and there were a lot of cases where medals should have been given out but were never issued, because there was no officer to see what they did, our officers being few and far between. Meanwhile, some of the attacking Japanese had made it to our ridge's top, and it was our job to get them off of there. This phase of the assault, Company L-35's defence of our ridge, is seldom mentioned in the official battle reports, and where historians have picked up on it, we get only brief mention. But had the Marines of L-35 failed to hold their positions, the overall operation that history books call the Battle of Bloody Ridge would have had a different outcome. By late morning, the young warriors who had survived the initial phase of the Japanese assault had moved their wounded back down from the ridge. Lieutenant Farmer was one of the wounded, having been badly hit in the arm and side. He was later given a medical discharge, went to law school, and eventually became a circuit court judge in Michigan. His BR man, whose nickname was Limey because he'd been born in England, also was badly wounded. Jim Motzinger, Harold Pazowski, and about a half-dozen others were clobbered on top of their ridge. But man, did they ever account for themselves. They were as tough and as stubborn a band of fighting men as any that the United States military has ever been fortunate enough to produce. No communications, no artillery or mortar supporting fire, and they still stacked those attacking Japanese while protecting the ridge with only some old rusty barbed wire and tin cans with pebbles. Sometime before noon, Lieutenant Flaherty pulled my squad after Captain Spurlock told him to take some men up to the ridge and see what we could do to help reinforce it. Michael S. Smith, in his fine book Bloody Ridge, The Battle That Saved Guadalcanal, sums up what we did in a single sentence. Second Lieutenant John Flashes Flaherty, Sergeant Orr Marion, and 8 other men from the platoon in the Grove helped Farmer hold his ground. This is correct, but there's quite a bit more to the story. Flaherty was one damn fine Marine. Nothing to the contrary should be read into the fact that on a few occasions he and I had some impolite verbal exchanges on points of disagreement, also known as yelling matches. I don't think blame should be put on either of us, but on the fact that we were 2 very young men stressed out by battle conditions and intensely aware that we were nearly always in immediate danger of being killed. Flaherty took off from the coconut grove, moving from cover to cover, with me and my squad directly behind him. We were running, and I was bent way over forward. I was directly behind Flaherty, and Hap Poloshian was right behind me. A Japanese machine gun opened up when we were about halfway up the ridge. The bullets missed Flaherty by inches. This former Yale football player was well over 6 feet tall and made a huge target. He stopped on a dime, then tripped and fell backward, which was a good thing because it probably prevented him from being hit by the enemy machine gun's second blast. I was a half pace behind Flaherty as he fell toward me, my rifle at the ready, with bayonet attached. He stumbled backward, lurching directly into my bayonet, which dug about a half-inch into his calf. He let out a yell. "I'm wounded! I'm wounded!" "Where?" I asked. "In the leg." "That ain't a wound. It's where my bayonet pig stuck you." "Why the hell did you do that?" he yelled. "I didn't do it. You fell on it," I yelled back. Back and forth went our stupid dialogue, and for all I know, the Japanese machine gunner was out there waiting for us to finish arguing before trying to take another shot at us. Finally, we calmed down. "Give me your bandage and I'll wrap it up," I told him. He was still grumbling while I was applying the bandage. "I'll have you court-martialed for this," he said. "Good," I said. "Have me court-martialed right away. I'm not happy here." He didn't have me court-martialed, and somehow we both managed to survive the ordeal. Years later, at a get-together in Boston, Hap Poloshian reminded me of that bayonet accident. "Holy shit! Why did you remind me of that?" I laughed, and Hap laughed too. Now we were able to laugh about it. But that morning, my squad was halfway up on L Company Ridge as replacements for the wounded that Lieutenant Farmer's platoon had suffered. During most of that time, we exchanged sporadic small arms fire with the Japanese at the very top. They couldn't dislodge us, and we weren't having much luck dislodging them from the ridge. After a while, Flash had to go back to get his leg taken care of, so there were no officers up on the ridge and no sergeants, the only NCOs being Corporals Clarence Aldridge, Frank Haberley, Hank Klemicki, and me. We spent several hours up there with our men, doing what we could to hold our position, but we had practically nothing to hold it with. I think what saved our day, and finally made it possible for us to hold our own and drive the Japanese off the top of the ridge, was the fact that we'd mustered about a half-dozen VB rifle grenades, that and the arrival of our mortarman, Carl Kelly from M Company, with maybe 3 or 4 rounds for his 60mm mortar. We answered the small arms fire from the Japanese at the top of the ridge by lobbing rifle grenades up at them. Then Kelly came up on the military crest with us. He sat with his mortar tube on the ground between his legs, and in order to hit the Japanese above us, he had the tube positioned almost straight up and down. "Carl, that son of a bitch is going to come straight down on top of us," I said. "I've got to do it this way, he told me. "It's the only way I can get them." To his credit, none of his mortar rounds came down on us. They dropped right on the ridgetop where the Japanese had their small foothold. After each round, he would move the mortar tube over a little bit, then drop another round on them. I think that saved our day on the ridge. Either he got the enemy or he forced them to keep their heads down. The few Japanese who survived eventually got the hell out of there. Meanwhile, we'd been hollering down the ridge toward our rear all morning, calling for artillery support, but we didn't get any until after Kelly's mortar rounds, and our own half-dozen or so rifle grenades had cleared the enemy off the ridge. By afternoon, after L Company had beaten back the worst of the Japanese attacks, somebody called up to us that our artillery was going to send out a few rounds. I think they were firing a 105mm. That help has been summarized very briefly on page 243 of battle historian Richard B. Frank's generally excellent book, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle. After thrashing through the jungle all night, one Japanese rifle company attacked in daylight a Marine position on the west of the perimeter held by Company L, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick C. Bebush. They were driven off with the help of a timely artillery barrage. What Frank doesn't say, and probably didn't know, is that the friendly artillery barrage did nearly as much damage to us as we'd done to the Japanese. I was one of 4 corporals positioned on the military crest with our squads. This was in the afternoon, and we'd received word that our artillery was finally going to give us a little support, after all the begging we'd done throughout the morning. The other squad leaders and I were talking about the fact that to maintain the defence perimeter in our sector, we had to have our men form a continuous line from the top of the ridge, then back down into the coconut grove. Because we corporals were the only rated men on the crest, it was up to us to decide how a defence line needed to be established, starting from our ridge and extending down to where the rest of the company was dug in. The other squad leaders with me were Aldridge, Haberley and Klimicki. I'll go down and find out where our flank is positioned, then I'll work my men into positions leading back up toward this ridge, I told them. Then I'll pass the word, and you guys can tie your squads in with mine. Just about the time they were saying, "Okay, that sounds all right," we heard the artillery boom sounding from our rear. "Damn!" I yelled. One of the other guys shouted, "Short!" The way it sounded, we knew the shell would be coming in on top of us. Having been shelled a dozen times or more by both enemy battleships and field artillery, we'd come to know what was coming in and where we had better not be. We recognized the friendly fire as coming from a pair of our 105S. I dove backward in a down-the-hill direction. I think I was still in mid-air when that damned thing landed near where I'd been kneeling. It was a powerful blast that sent me flying backward, and I couldn't even draw a breath. In that instant, I sensed that the man just turned the page that had my name written on it. My clothes were torn and twisted, my helmet went flying off somewhere, and there was dirt in my eyes and mouth and ears. I thought that was the end for me. It wasn't, but it was damn near the end for the other squad leaders. For a few minutes I was off in a world of my own. I couldn't feel or see a thing. I couldn't even hear anything. Next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, spitting out dirt, and frightened. There had to be a wound somewhere on my body, and pain to go with it, but I wasn't feeling much of anything. Then I began to hear moans, crying, and all the bad noises that come as an aftermath to a disaster. When I was able to look around, I saw my fellow corporals, all three of them, badly wounded. At that moment it dawned on me that Seapull or J. Marion had made it alive through another day. Aldridge was lying in the dirt with a chunk of muscle hanging out of one of his arms. That bloody arm was filled with little pieces of metal. Klimicki was sprawled in the dirt, one of his legs at about a 45-degree angle away from normal. Haberley was out cold, lying in his own blood. He was full of shrapnel, his entire body riddled with pieces of steel, and I could tell he was hurt bad. Aldridge later underwent 3 or 4 major operations, and eventually was able to move his arm in a normal manner. He stayed in the Corps, retired after 20 years, and died a few years after his retirement. Klimicki had to undergo several operations on his leg, and he spent several years in and out of hospitals before he returned to civilian life. We keep in touch. As of 2002, Hank was doing well, living in Florida, and playing golf as often as the weather permitted. We never heard what became of Haberley after he was evacuated. We could only hope for the best. To this day, I don't know how or why I escaped serious injury, but somehow I didn't have one piece of shrapnel in me. The men in my squad had been all hunkered down when the shell exploded, and nobody was hurt. As far as I know, the men in the other squads weren't hurt either, just their squad leaders. I had escaped with one more very close call. Other things like that incident had happened to me before, and would happen again, but that short artillery shell was the closest call during my 4 months on Guadalcanal. You never get used to those things. Never. Klimicki, Aldridge and Haberley were so badly wounded that we couldn't wait for help to come up to us from a corpsman. Several of the men carried the squad leaders down the hill where they could be taken care of. As for the rest of us, we had a job to do, so we stayed. We didn't have a choice in the matter. We manoeuvred the men in our squads the way we'd planned. I tied my squad in on the right, and Aldridge's squad, now minus Aldridge, tied in with me. Later that day, when we got up to the top of our ridge, we found about a half-dozen dead Japanese, probably the victims of our few rifle grenades and Carl Kelly's mortar rounds. The rest of the attackers had vanished into the jungle, their assault thwarted. We stayed on the ridge the rest of that day, then all through the night and into the following morning, holding our position. The Japanese attack had failed, and nothing more happened in our sector during that night or the next day. Just sporadic small arms fire here and there. The following day, Major Barbet and Lieutenant Colonel Bebush, L Company's commander, came up on our ridge. Barbet formed a reconnaissance patrol that included my squad, and we took off, moving down off the ridge into the jungle foliage, roughly into an area where part of the Japanese attack had originally come at us. We couldn't have been much more than 100 or 150 yards out from our MLR when we discovered what had happened to the Japanese dead. At first we encountered no enemy at all, alive or dead, but we knew we were moving in the right direction because we were following a trail of bloody bandages. Then, before we could see where the Japanese had dumped their dead, we heard it. We heard the droning buzz of millions of flies, swarming in a dark cloud over a large area of stinking ground. That's where their bodies were. There must have been 100 of them at that location. The retreating Japanese had tried to cover their dead, spreading shovelfuls of dirt over the corpses, but the arms, legs, faces and torsos were barely covered, and the flies were thick and buzzing all over them. Flies were everywhere, and the stench of dead flesh was everywhere. It was clear to Major Barbet and to the rest of us that the Japanese who had survived the battle were nowhere nearby, so we returned to our positions on the MLR. The Battle of Bloody Ridge, and of our own L Company Ridge, was over. The scattered Japanese who retreated from the Bloody Ridge attack, which was to our east, gradually drifted back in a westward direction. We were able to spot many of them off in the distance, making their way in the direction that took them toward the Matanikau River. They were completely disorganized and in bad physical shape. Some of them no longer had weapons. If the Japanese had been able to exploit the situation when a few of them succeeded in making it to the crest of our ridge, they would have been down to the new fighter strip in no time at all. But they had taken casualties, a lot more casualties than we took, and it seems that there weren't enough Japanese left to sustain their attack. The Japanese who attacked our sector of the perimeter had clearly intended to stay and take over. On top of L Company Ridge after the battle was over, we found a dead Japanese officer still clutching 2 leather briefcases chock full of new Japanese currency. My guess is that they either planned to hold pay call or were going to try to buy the airfield from us. Or maybe that champion was a card shark or dice-rolling hustler, ready to open up shop as soon as the firefight was over. In fact, the firefight was over. The Japanese assault on Bloody Ridge and the simultaneous attack on our own L Company Ridge had ended with their defeat. The thwarted Japanese attack that later became known to the world as the Battle of Bloody Ridge was genuine good news, and as such it made it into the American newspapers right away. Here are the headlines over the story that my family read in the Buffalo Evening News on September 16th. In late September, one of L Company's officers gathered our platoon for a briefing. As usual, these meetings often signalled trouble. This time, the lieutenant informed us about the dire air support situation and how we, the ground troops, were expected to assist the beleaguered pilots. The fighter pilots, part of the Cactus Air Force, were doing an exceptional job, despite their outdated and increasingly unreliable planes. Their task was becoming more dangerous by the day. The lieutenant shared an unusual strategy from one of the pilots. When the pilot ran out of ammo or was low on fuel, he would attempt to lure a Japanese Zero into a position where we on the ground could shoot at it. The idea was to use our small arms fire to assist the struggling airmen. The plan seemed straightforward and exciting. During training, we had practiced snapping in on low-flying aircraft, so the lieutenant's idea felt like a practical application of that practice. We were eager to contribute and optimistic about our chances. The plan was to lead the plane by 3 lengths and take our shots, just like in practice. The next morning, while in our defensive positions in the coconut grove, we witnessed a dogfight between our Wildcats and Japanese bombers, accompanied by Zero fighters. As one of our Wildcats maneuvered with a Zero on its tail, it headed directly toward us. We prepared for the moment, assuming our positions and aiming our rifles as the planes came overhead. We fired a few shots, but the planes quickly disappeared, and the action was over before we knew it. Later that day, the lieutenant debriefed us. Despite our enthusiasm, it turned out our shots had not hit the zero, but had instead damaged the tail of our own wildcat. The pilot, a friend of the lieutenant, was not impressed with our marksmanship and made it clear that our efforts were not up to par. The lieutenant's feedback was blunt. He explained that we were supposed to lead the planes by exactly 3 lengths, not more. He left us with a sense of frustration, and we were left to reflect on the reality of our situation. The humour among us was that next they might expect us to fly the planes ourselves. The first guy said, "We led 'em by 3 lengths, didn't we? So we hit the wrong damn plane. What do they expect from us? Miracles?" Somebody else piped in. "It wasn't our idea anyway. The planes go by with a whoosh, and they expect us to hold an exact 3-length lead. Hell, we got crazy people leading us in a crazy war." "Yeah," the first guy said. "If we had food in our stomachs, we'd have heartburn by now." But that flyboy wasn't kidding. That was the first and the last flyby of that kind that had anything to do with us. So much for the good idea we'd inherited from World War I. Like so much else, it wasn't worth a damn in World War II. Promotion time. By late September, jungle warfare had taken its toll on us. Chronic lack of food and medical supplies, malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and other tropical diseases were causing more marine casualties than combat. Nearly every one of us was suffering. My platoon had moved out to our isolated ridge and established our position, but practically before I knew it, both Lieutenant Flaherty and our platoon sergeant were gone to the field hospital, both down with malaria attacks. By the last couple of days of September, and without anybody to tell me, I'd become the senior man in Company L35's 1st Platoon. That put me in charge whether I liked it or not. Our other 2 platoons were in the same fix. The 2nd Platoon had lost Lieutenant George Meade, killed in action at Matanikau back in August. Then they'd lost Lieutenant Farmer when he was badly wounded in the September 13th, 14 Japanese attack on L Company Ridge. That left Sea Pilotal Raleigh Bright in charge. The 3rd Platoon was only a little better off. It had lost its lieutenant to malaria, which left Platoon Sergeant Walt Singsek in charge, with CPL Paul Morris, his second in charge. I had the 1st Platoon dug in on the military crest of our area of responsibility. By that time, the entire platoon's strength was down to a dozen or 15 men. Every one of us was sick, with malaria, diarrhea, or both, and we were all physically weak from lack of food and sleep. Back in those days, the Marines didn't have talking doctors or psychiatrists, and we didn't know the meaning of depression. Everybody in every one of our platoons was in the same physical and mental condition. We lived on several tablespoons of captured Japanese rice per day, that is, if anyone brought it out to us. Our water situation was about as bad. Not enough of it, and sometimes it wasn't available at all. Somebody in the rear with the gear, which is to say a mighty plan maker at company command, decided that we should cut our field of fire at the foot of our ridge. That's Marine manual terminology for cutting down the area's tall grass and foliage to provide visibility in case we ever had to fire on the approaching enemy with our automatic weapons. According to the manual, cutting a field of fire is what is supposed to be done as soon as your position is established. But what we discovered the hard way was that the Japanese didn't cut their own fields of fire, and on more than one occasion our guys walked right into the path of fire of their Nambu light machine guns. In other words, the Japanese attitude was, screw the manuals, which is what they did. We suffered for it. What's more, on too many occasions, cutting our fields turned out to be a dead giveaway, revealing our own positions to the Japanese. I'd been acting platoon leader for a day or so when somebody from our company showed up with a grub hook and a rusty old machete left over from one of our banana wars. They were our tools for cutting a field of fire. For the following day or two, I sent 3 men at a time down to the bottom of the ridge and into a ravine-like area to do some bushwhacking below the field of fire for our bars and our 1 light machine gun. What should have taken half a day under better circumstances seemed to go on forever. We couldn't make much progress because the men were too sick and too weak for that kind of work in jungle heat and humidity. The routine called for 2 men to whack away at the foliage, while the third man kept them covered with his weapon. For extra defensive protection, we'd strung a strand of barbed wire below the area where the men were cutting. It was the same idea as Lieutenant Farmer's trick during his platoon's defence of L Company Ridge. We hung a rusty ration can on the wire and put a couple of pebbles into the can. If someone or something touched the wire, the can rattled and gave us warning. On the second or third day of this brilliant military exercise, and with all my men too sick to do much work, I decided to get the damned job over with fast. I picked out 2 men who weren't as sick as the others. Then I led them down the ridge. I decided that I'd cover them with my rifle while they used the cutting tools and finished up this useless, futile exercise. After about an hour, one of my men up topside on the ridge called down to us. "Patrol coming in!" "Good," I called back. "Do they have any chow?" We continued our work for about another 5 minutes when I got another call from the ridge. "You're wanted up here." The problem was that if I climbed back up to the crest, my 2 grass cutters would have to come up with me. They couldn't work down there without anybody to cover for them. "You'd better tell him to come down here," I called back. "Because once we come up there, our work's over for the day." The next voice that came down to me from the ridge belonged to my assistant and barman, Larry Gherkin. "Damn it! Get your ass up here!" Gherkin never talked like that to anyone unless it was something serious. The nearest he usually came to cussing was to say, "Geez." This, I guessed, was something serious. We struggled up the steep embankment. The ground was so rough and we were so damned weak that it must have taken us 10 minutes to pull ourselves, drag ourselves, and sometimes just crawl back up to the ridge. At last I got to the top, and I was sucking wind through all my orifices. I found myself standing face to face with a gentleman, he must have been a gentleman, dressed in clean khakis, with a clean-shaven face and neatly trimmed hair. His attitude was what I call Naval Academy impatient. "Are you in charge here?" he asked. I figured that this champion must be a bird colonel at least, and a true stalwart warrior, so I stood at strict attention. His detail consisted of about 8 men guarding him. There I stood, all 5 feet 6 inches and 100 pounds of me, my hair long and hanging, no shave or bath for maybe 2 weeks. I replied to our young hero, "Yes, sir, I'm in charge." "What were you doing down there?" he asked. "We're finishing up cutting our fields of fire, which I am not in favour of doing." "If you're in charge, why are you down there working?" he demanded. "Sir," I said, "these men are sick. I felt that under these conditions I could show them my concern." "What is your rank?" he demanded. "Sir," I said, "I am a corporal." "Corporal," said this brave warrior, "as long as you have 1 man under you who can stand and work, you will supervise and oversee the job. If you can't understand that, we can always revert you to the rank of private." I was standing at attention and listening, but I was looking at this well-fed, well-groomed officer, and I was thinking, up yours. What I did say was, "Sir, if you're going back to the MLR from here, can we have your water?" Every man in his detail had 2 water canteens hanging from their belts, and we hadn't had water for a couple of days. I didn't give our hero a chance to answer my question. "Water, men!" I shouted. "Come and get it!" From out of their dug-out holes in the ground and from out of the underbrush came a dozen or so men from my dirty, unshaven, raggedy-ass platoon. They were really just a bunch of kids who needed a lot of things, but were willing to settle for something as simple as water. They looked like kids, because that's exactly what they were. But later on, somebody describing the Guadalcanal campaign called them the Magnificent Fools, and that's what they were to me. A bunch of raggedy-ass magnificent fools. And to this day, I love every last one of them, above and below the sod. This visiting detachment didn't want to exchange canteens with us, because anybody could see that we were a bunch of unclean, diseased slobs. Instead, they let us pour the water from their canteens into ours, losing several precious gulps of water that splashed on the ground in each exchange. To this day, old veterans who were on the canal but weren't out on the MLR are unable to understand the desperate situation we were in. The one good thing that happened that day is that once that chicken shit officer in his pressed khakis turned around and led his detail off our ridge, I never saw him again. Through the rest of my 20 years in the Corps, I never laid eyes on that jerk a second time. We didn't have much when we were out on that ridge, but by this time we did have a field telephone. Next morning, my telephone man was lying on the ground maybe 10 feet from me, with the field phone up to his ear. He turned to me and said, "Looks like they're going to make some promotions in the ranks. The battalion switchboard man was just telling me they're going to promote about a half-dozen guys to sergeant." "That's real neighbourly," I said. "Let me know what comes of it all." For a while I just continued lying there with a blank mind and not giving much of a damn about anything. Then I started thinking about those promotions, which I knew were now being discussed back at headquarters. What about me? Why the hell can't they promote me? All right, I'm one of the regiment's junior corporals, but so what? Who the hell's got the responsibility of leading this platoon out here on the front line? I have. I'm doing the job. I started thinking about that asshole in the clean uniform, threatening to demote me, his only reason being that I was helping my men. So he threatened to demote me. The hell with him. Why shouldn't I be promoted instead? "Edwards," I said, "give me that phone." I cranked up the phone, and the company clerk, Ralph Rivera, came on. I told him I wanted to speak to the first sergeant. "The first sergeant isn't around," Rivera said. "How about the new company commander?" I asked. "Captain Smith." Rivera told me that the acting first sergeant, who happened to be my old buddy Ben Selvitel, and Captain Smith were at a meeting at battalion command. I asked him who was there who had some authority, and Rivera told me that the exec officer, First Lieutenant Guffin, was there. I told Rivera that I had some kind words I wanted to exchange with Guffin. Mr. Guffin, who was a nice guy and a competent officer, came on the field phone. "Lieutenant," I said, "I've been told some promotions are going to be made. The reason I'm taking up your time is to ask if my name will be on the promotion list." "To be honest with you, your name wasn't mentioned in any of our conversations," Guffin said. "Mr. Guffin," I said, "in all the special details and all the extra details I've been assigned, no one has complained or found fault with my performance. I know that I'm a junior corporal in the regiment. If you guys don't think I'm ready for promotion or you don't think I'm competent to be promoted, then you'd best send someone out here to take over the platoon, because right now I'm the only man who's leading it. And that somebody had better be here by the crack of dawn, because I'm pissed, and I'm going to come in early tomorrow morning and report for brig time for leaving my post." Lieutenant Guffin was a good warrior. I liked him personally and didn't intend to give him a hard time, but at the same time I was telling myself that what's fair is fair. So now I told the lieutenant, "I'm out here and I'm responsible for what's left of this platoon. We're all hungry and we're all sick, dirty, stinking and unwashed. I'm holding these poor meatheads together on this damned hot ridge, and if command doesn't think I'm acting responsibly and capably, then the only thing that makes sense for them to do is to relieve me. Mr. Guffin," I went on, "if by sunset I'm not informed that my name will be on that promotion list, you'll see me shortly after 0800 hours tomorrow morning." Guffin sympathised, but he went on and on with a song and dance, the conclusion being that he'd see what he could do, but that he couldn't promise me anything. That's how our phone conversation ended. Just as the sky was getting dark, we got a tap on our field phone. It was Sergeant Ben Selvitel, and he wanted to speak to me. I got on the phone. "Or," he said, "I don't know what your conversation with Guffin was all about, but I've been told to inform you that your promotion to sergeant will be effective on October 1st, 1942. Congratulations, old buddy. And by the way, I've just been promoted to gunny sergeant." "Thanks for the info, Ben," I said. "Congratulations to you too." Ben deserved his promotion too. He was a damned fine Marine who stayed in the Corps for 35 years, getting a commission and rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel by the time he retired. He held several important jobs and was always a credit to the Corps and to his country. Because of the age factor, he couldn't be promoted higher than Lieutenant Colonel. But as of the following day, October 1st, 1942, Ben was the youngest gunnery sergeant in the entire 1st Marine Division. As it turned out, the awful month of September 1942 ended on a good note for some of us. There was something unusual happening on Mount Austin, the 1,300-foot rise that formed the normally unchanging green backdrop for our island ordeal. Back in August, when we first arrived on the island and looked up at the side of Mount Austin, the only thing we saw was heavy green foliage that covered it in an unbroken climb to its mounded top. When we stood facing out to the beach and the deep blue bay beyond, Mount Austin was back over our left shoulder, its heavy dark green foliage punctuated only by the zigzag rises of barren coral ridges that accented the surrounding jungle lowlands. But one day there was a line on its surface, plain for all of us to see, as if somebody had started moving the foliage. The line kept getting bigger and bigger. You had to be blind not to see it, but no one said anything officially. After a time, you learned not to report everything you saw. Report something funny going on, and before you knew it, you'd be on a 2-day hike trying to find out what the Japanese were up to. So we never said anything about that bare-looking line cutting through the foliage. At about the same time, from the ridge we were on, we could see Japanese ships landing troops at Point Cruz. I believe it was the beginning of October when General Vandergrift came up on our ridge, and we called out to him, "Hey, how you doing, AA?" We were in battle, everything was informal, and Vandergrift didn't mind when he showed up somewhere, and the men called him AA. The AA stood for Alexander Archer. Somebody in our company called out, "What the hell are you doing up here, General?" "I just got a message from General MacArthur," he told us. "He's sending some planes to help us out. They should be coming by very shortly." That was something worth looking for. So we waited and waited, but it wasn't shortly, and after a while we sensed that the general was getting impatient. Finally, we spotted planes in the sky, 3 of them, and they were very high. I'd never seen an airplane flying that high. They were big 4-engine bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, which at that time were the largest planes in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the forerunner of today's Air Force. The planes were coming toward us from the general direction of Florida Island, and for all I know, they might have come all the way from New Guinea. Now, high over the bay, they were as plainly visible to us as to the Japanese transport ship that was unloading troops off Point Cruz. It seemed clear to every one of us on the ridge that the enemy transport was our bomber's logical target. Then, when the B-17S were roughly halfway between Savo Island and the Guadalcanal shoreline, they opened their bomb bay doors and down came the bombs. They weren't anywhere near the Japanese ship, probably not within a mile of it. All the bombs came down in the middle of the bay, exploding as they hit the water, which was the middle of nowhere. Then the 3 planes veered off and disappeared. The Japanese transport ship continued unloading its troops, and there were no additional bombers, no more bombs. As the B-17S flew away, Vandergrift jumped up and yelled, "Jesus Christ!" He took off his helmet and threw it on the ground. He cussed some more, then picked up his helmet, slapped it on his head, and went stomping down and away from our position. "Stop up and see us again sometime," a couple of the Marines called, but he probably didn't hear them. He was too furious about what he'd just seen the flyboys do. There weren't even any zeros up in the sky to try to stop them. Every time one of our planes flew a mission, its crew got credit in their records, whether they accomplished anything or not. That day, I guess they were more interested in completing their mission than in whether or not they found and hit an enemy target. This early October incident started shortly after dinner time. That was a stretch, calling a skimpy ration of wormy rice dinner. Our platoon was ordered to get our gear, move out of our Coconut Grove position on the western edge of the MLR, and dig in down on the beach. The scoop had it that a Japanese fleet with troop transports was headed our way and would probably appear around midnight. Within about 10 minutes, we were digging new spider holes on the beach, making them a little deeper than usual, pampering our weapons, and establishing watches that would continue between nightfall and 2300 hours. After that, it would be all troops on alert. Just before sunset, 2 jeeps pulled up to our beach position, one of them towing a 75mm howitzer, the other pulling a large searchlight and a generator. The battalion's exec officer arrived shortly behind them, and he was soon in deep discussion with the artillery officer and his crew. We saw them pointing out along the beach in the direction of Matanikau and Point Cruz. Our own platoon leader, Lieutenant Flash Flaherty, was not invited to this high-level and very big-deal meeting, which had him feeling as left out as the rest of us. "The hell with them," I heard somebody mutter. "Who gives a damn about what they're doing with that gun and searchlight?" By the time sunset neared, the big searchlight was positioned to face in the same direction the artillery masterminds had been pointing, toward Matanikau and Point Cruz. The light wasn't turned on yet, but we saw plainly where it was pointing. We also saw the crew break out a half-dozen or so rounds of howitzer ammo. At that stage of the campaign, we all knew that the Japanese were strutting around on the Matanikau Point Cruz area like they owned the damned place and planned on setting up permanent housekeeping there. For our own part, we were harassing hell out of them whenever we had the chance, and when our air guys had a plane that could fly, they were anxious to help us by dropping an extra bomb or two into that area. Night in the jungle always comes suddenly, and as usual, darkness came that evening like gangbusters. Immediately the generator started up and the big searchlight came on. It illuminated the beach line, then swung all the way out to Matanikau, lighting up the area so that it looked like high noon on California's Long Beach Turnpike. We raggedy-ass Marine infantrymen had been blasé about this mysterious artillery operation, but our attitude changed the moment that damned searchlight came to life. Now we were coming to life too, because we knew the light was bound to draw enemy fire. Back then, and to the present day, if there is anything that a gravel-crunching Marine infantryman hates, it is something or somebody who might draw unfriendly fire into his area. Drawing enemy fire at night is worse than doing it during the daytime, and we were well aware that a bright searchlight coming from our area was detrimental to our health and well-being. The artillery crew received fire orders, and the night was suddenly shattered with a blam. They fired on a flat trajectory along the beach and into Matanikau. There was a pause for correction, followed by another 6 or 8 deafening rounds of "Take that, you lousy Japanese fools!" In a way, we were lucky. There was no return fire. Within minutes, the searchlight was out, the jeep started up, and both the howitzer and the light were gone. That left us with another long night to stay alert and wait for daybreak. Around midnight, a couple of Japanese warships eased our way, looking to find out where that gunfire had come from. And then, for the following 20 minutes, guess who got plastered with enemy shellfire? The first platoon of L.3, 5. There we were, crouched at the bottom of our spider holes, hugging the walls for dear life, and cussing at both the enemy and our own artillery champions. It could have been worse, since all they did was scare the hell out of us. We didn't take any casualties, and the feared Japanese assault on our beach never took place. As the Guadalcanal campaign wore on and weeks turned into months, our spider holes were starting to break down. Japanese ships would pay their offshore social calls most evenings and send us a few rounds just so we wouldn't start thinking we owned the damned place. Then, later at night, Washing Machine Charlie would drop a few bombs to let us know it was time to change the watch. During daylight hours, usually late morning or early afternoon, Major Smith and 1 or 2 others from the Cactus Air Force would get our few operational Grumman fighters off the ground, and that usually gave them a chance to tear up a couple of Japanese bombers, though it didn't stop the Japanese from dumping a flock of bombs all over the place. In quieter moments, Pistol Pete was likely to drop a few indiscriminate rounds into our sector just to keep us honest. Let me describe our spider holes, and why, when we got some time on our hands, we started thinking about building something a little more luxurious. A foxhole typically was a narrow trench with 2 or 3 or more guys in it. We found out real quick that a better way to protect ourselves, especially from the air attacks and falling shrapnel, was to build something we called spider holes. You'd dig in the wet, sandy earth with your helmet, say 6 feet down, in a column just big enough for you to stand up in. Everyone made his own, so you fashioned it the way you wanted it. Most of us built a little sandstool at the bottom on one side, and widened the spider hole out a little so you could stretch your legs. You might cut out a little shelf for a canteen or a jug of water. You'd lie on the ground next to your spider hole, and when the shelling or bombing started, you'd jump into it and pull 2 sandbags together overhead to close it off. We were so close to the ocean at high tide that we'd get a little brackish water splashing around at our feet. Spider holes offered pretty good protection, but they weren't very comfortable. With all that shelling and bombing and other commotion beating hell out of our spider holes, we were understandably nervous. That's when we decided that we'd build a bunker, a first-class bomb shelter to surpass all others on Guadalcanal. We managed to get in a little planning between the routine of daily patrols and incoming enemy fire, and then we started digging our shelter, using our few entrenching tools along with a couple of shovels the Japanese had left behind. We also found an old Japanese saw that we could use for felling trees. Our plan called for a dugout, 7 feet square and 7 feet deep. Its entrance would be a slide so we could get in there fast when the shit hit the fan. Its covering top would be made of coconut logs, topped with a layer of Japanese sandbags, and with more sand piled on top of the bags. It would be the island's most magnificent bunker, bar none. Our bunker's site was in the coconut grove beyond the west-facing end of the new fighter strip. Some of our guys dug while others sawed fallen trees. The Japanese saw was the type that cuts only on the pull stroke, but it was all we had, so we made do. Larry Hardrock Gherkin was honcho on the tree-cutting detail. Work being intermittent, it took us about a week to complete our masterpiece. With the final sandbag in place one hot, muggy morning, we stood around our bunker and told each other what an excellent engineering feat we'd accomplished. From now on, we assured ourselves, we'd have no more worries during Japanese shellings and bombings. A visitor from the next platoon came over to help us admire our accomplishment, so Gherkin invited him below to inspect our bomb-proof marvel. Just about then, the air raid siren sounded. Minutes later, we heard, then saw, 5 or 6 Japanese bombers coming in our direction, the red meatballs shining on their wings in the full sunlight. Gherkin and the others stayed down in the bunker, and the rest of us remained in the open, waiting to see where the planes were going to release their bombs. By now we were pros at this game, able to estimate where the bombs would land from the moment we saw them drop out of the planes. And now that we had this magnificent bunker, all we had to do was slide into it for protection, just in case a couple of the bombs appeared to be coming too close. As we watched, a couple of our Grummons went up into the sky to give the bombers hell. That could have been reason enough for the bombers to start releasing their loads a little early. Instead of falling toward Henderson Field, those bombs would be hitting the earth in our vicinity. We started diving into our new bunker head first, because the bombs were coming straight at us. We listened to the approaching explosions. The first hit was short, but in line. The second walked in a little closer. The third hit our bunker smack on top and right in the middle. And there we were, about 8 of us, hunched down in that sucker. The noise was deafening. The logs serving as our bunker's roof came partway down on top of us, followed by sand. For several minutes after that, none of us could hear a thing. We couldn't see a thing either, because our eyes were full of sand. We were sputtering, spitting sand out of our mouths, and digging like hell to get out of that damned hole. Finally, I managed to pull myself out of the rubble and up to solid ground, then reached down and helped a couple buddies out behind me. We were all out by now except Hardrock Gherkin. He was still down there, but we knew he was alive and conscious because we could hear him caterwauling like a scolded mule. He must have been holding hundreds of pounds of dirt and logs on his back. Now, we all knew that Gherk was the strongest man in L Company, and maybe the strongest man in the entire 1st Marine Division, but there's a limit to what one man can hold on his back. What's more, we all knew that if anything bad was going to happen to anybody, it was going to happen to Hardrock first. We dug with our hands, pushed and pulled logs out of the way, and finally pulled Gherk out of the structure that, for barely an hour, had been our finished, magnificent bomb-proof shelter. It took a little while to get the sand and dirt out of our eyes and mouths, and the fright out of our systems. We cursed the sons of the rising sun, we cursed their bombers, and we cursed Tokyo Rose for good measure. By some miracle, nobody was hurt, and as we realized that and started recovering from the shock of our close call, we found ourselves laughing. We filled up the best bomb shelter on Guadalcanal and went back to our less comfortable but safer individual spider holes. Speaking of Japanese bombs, here is one of the funnier examples of bad information that made it back to the home front at a time when Japanese Betty bombers were appearing overhead every day between August and December 1942 to plaster us with bombs, and when Washing Machine Charlie was drifting in every night to shake us up a little with a bomb or two of his own. This headline appeared in the Buffalo Evening News on September 14th. I wonder which war this story was talking about. It was the crack of dawn on October 7th, and all hands in L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment were awake. We were busy filling our canteens with water and getting extra rounds of ammunition. Both the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 5th Marine Regiment had been ordered to move west from our MLR and advance to the Matanikau River, and that included us. We were getting ready for what would later be officially listed as the Matanikau River Engagement, October 7th, 1942. As we moved out, word came to L Company, "This time you're going to be in reserve." "Jesus, it's about time," one of my guys muttered. "We're finally getting a break." "They must have made a mistake," somebody else remarked. Nobody in my unit seemed to be thinking the situation out, and none of us realized what would be in store for us before the day was over. Being in reserve is not always an enviable position. In fact, it's often downright hazardous. Our mission was to hold our position on the river's east bank and be prepared to cross it if and when we received orders to do so. The 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, moved through our position and were soon well out ahead of us, heading toward the Matanikau River. Following them were I and K companies of our own battalion. Other units that participated were the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, which had come from Tulagi, and Colonel Merritt Edson's Raiders, who, back in September, had played a large part in the defence of Bloody Ridge. At the same time, Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's battalion, which was part of the 7th Marine Regiment, was somewhere out on the opposite side of the Matanikau, on a flanking mission. Our company moved down the Copra Cart Road, using the same route Colonel Oka's Japanese troops had taken in mid-September, before we'd stopped their advance on L Company Ridge. The difference was that back then they'd been coming at us from west to east. Now we were going after them, from east to west. When we were about halfway to the river, we got orders to fall out on each side of the road. I heard somebody in my platoon say, "I could fight a war like this all my life." Famous last words. Up ahead, we started hearing small arms fire. First our own, then the higher-pitched sound of Nambu light machine gun fire. The Japanese were shooting back. It wasn't long before a jeep came bumping along the road, returning from the firefight. It carried 3 or 4 wounded Marines. We were about to find out that I and K companies had run into trouble at a spot located just before the Matanikau crossing. That was the first piece of bad news. The Japanese were supposed to be on the other side of the river, but they were on our side of it. L Company's runner appeared and approached our platoon to relay an order. "Move forward to the old man." By that, he meant that we were ordered to go to our company commander, Captain Lyman Spurlock. We moved forward and found our CO conferring with an officer from battalion headquarters. By now I had my sergeant's stripes, which put me in charge of my platoon, since Lieutenant Flaherty, the official platoon leader, was still temporarily out of action with malaria. Our CO and the battalion officer turned to L Company's platoon leaders, which on this day included me. "Move up to the line and hold it until I and K companies join you on your left and right flanks. Then gradually pull back and let them fill the gap until their flanks join." He didn't tell us the exact nature of the situation, only what we were expected to accomplish. There had to be a reason why that gap existed in the first place, but nobody was about to give us reasons. Common sense dictated one of 2 probable choices. 1, the terrain was so bad that it was nearly impossible to move through it. 2, the enemy had some very bad things in place on that spot. Whatever the situation, we would now have to face it. Another runner appeared to guide us toward that gap in the line, and we started moving out. The runner led my platoon up to a spot where the vegetation was so thick that if I'd stuck my hand forward and into it, I couldn't have seen my fingers. It was the edge of what today they call a rainforest. On the canal, we just called it jungle. Our guide pointed off to one side and told me, "K Company is over there." Then he indicated the opposite direction. "I Company is over there. Good luck." With that, he left us. Directly through the thick vegetation ahead of us was the east bank of the Matanikau River. Rifle fire crackled around us. Now and then we heard what was becoming the too familiar cry from a wounded Marine. "Corpsman!" Our platoon's 3 squads, none at full strength, started to deploy. We left one squad in reserve while the other 2 began penetrating the thick jungle. Immediately all hell broke loose. Enemy machine guns accompanied by an unknown number of riflemen opened up and started having a field day at our expense. They just weren't supposed to be on our side of the river, but nobody had the nerve to tell them as much. Anyhow, we now knew why the gap existed in our line, both reason number 1 and reason number 2. A couple of our guys got wounded right away. PFC Joe Parker was one of them. Before the Guadalcanal campaign was over, Joe would be wounded 3 times and was finally evacuated from the island, but he somehow survived it all. On this occasion, he was down and couldn't move, and it was a long time before a corpsman was able to get to him. For what seemed like forever, he was in clear view of the Japanese, who just let him lie there as bait. We knew that if any one of us tried to get near him, we'd be clobbered by the machine guns they had in place, waiting for us to come out into the open. I don't know how our guys finally got Joe out of there, only that they eventually managed to save him. I learned later that before our arrival, another Marine platoon had tried to fill the gap at the spot where my platoon was now positioned, and their dead and wounded were now scattered among us in the jungle growth. In short order, several of my own men joined their ranks. We remained pinned down in that position for 12 hours. You lie there or crouch behind the cover of a tree, wondering what to do next. You know the enemy is only 50 feet away. You can hear them. You call back and forth to your buddies, and the Japanese can hear you. We didn't know a word of Japanese at that time, and they probably couldn't understand anything we were shouting. So you just sit tight. You learned patience because if you didn't have patience, you were going to die. When I tried to fill in the gap between K and I companies with L Company's 1st platoon, I made several mad dashes from one temporary shelter to another with Hap Pelosian. The underbrush around us and in front of us was very thick. We finally made it to a spot behind a banyan tree, its trunk maybe 4 feet in diameter. The Japanese were dug in at about the thickest part of the underbrush with several machine guns and a number of riflemen. They kept tattooing our tree with everything they had. On our side, where we were protected from their line of fire, it sounded like tom-toms. Their rifles and machine guns had our whole unit pinned down and stuck where we were. Our only way of communicating was hollering back and forth among ourselves, which we did. Through bursts of gunfire, we also could hear the Japanese shouting back and forth. By late afternoon, we heard a lot of thrashing behind us, and Major Lou Walt of the Raider Battalion appeared from out of the brush. He was in a kneeling position, making himself a good target for the enemy. I started to holler, "Get down!" Whatever else I had to say was lost in the noise of hell breaking loose, all of it directed at Walt. He went down damn fast and miraculously escaped without a scratch. I could see the shrubs, vines, and everything that grew around him being cut down by bullets. After a while, the gunfire quieted down, and Major Walt crawled in a little closer to our position. "I wanted to see what was holding you people up," he said. "I found out pretty fast, didn't I?" With that, he crawled out backward, heading in the direction he'd come from, and it wasn't until the next morning, after the fiasco was over, that I saw anybody else from the Raider unit. Major Walt was a good officer, and when Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson was promoted to full colonel after Bloody Ridge and later given command of our 5th Regiment, Walt came with him. Walt was always looking things over, making sure the details were carried out. Having the judgment to select men like Walt and other top-flight officers to assist him was a major reason for Colonel Edson's success in the Corps. 2 or 3 years after the war, I had an opportunity to read what was considered an official account of the October 7th 9 Matanikau battle in a book titled The Old Breed, A History of the 1st Marine Division in World War II by George Macmillan. This account is inaccurate in several details. Macmillan states correctly that L.3.5, my unit, joined the firefight in the morning at about 1,000 hours, or approximately 3 hours after we'd started moving down the old Copra Cart Road from our MLR. I assume he's also correct when he goes on to say that our regiment's 2nd Battalion turned slightly left, which would be inland, as they approached the east bank of the river, but he's mistaken when he claims that they marched to the river without opposition. I could hear the opposition clearly enough, as could everybody else in the 3rd Battalion. Macmillan does qualify his statement a little, saying, "The only fly in the ointment were some Japanese that 3-5 had bottled up on our side of the river." Again, he's inaccurate. We didn't bottle them up. They were very well dug in, and it's more nearly correct to say that they had us bottled up. The situation didn't change in any important way through the course of that day. On the following day, Merritt Edson's Raider Company came in from reserve to join the fight. Macmillan goes on to say that during the first night, a comparatively small company of bottled-up Japanese did nothing, while several of our amphibious vehicles ground around in the darkness to confuse them. I don't recall any of our vehicles being there at the time. What did happen was that through much of that very dark night, the Japanese made very little sound, maybe firing an occasional shot or two from their Nambus to keep us alert and make us nervous. Then, in the middle of that night, or what was more likely the very early hours of the following morning, Macmillan says that those bottled-up Japanese rushed out of their position, screaming and hollering and running toward the beach, which was very close to where they'd been dug in. So far, so good. He goes on to say that their charge inflicted heavy casualties on our raiders, who were positioned nearest to them. This is a mistake because the raiders didn't show up until after daybreak, and by that time the battle was over. At that time I saw raiders crossing the Matanikau River at the sand spit where it flows out to sea. I knew several of the raiders' NCOs either personally or by sight, because that outfit had been formed back at New River when they took men from the 5th Marines 1st Battalion. I point out Macmillan's mistake here, because I believe it has been picked up in good faith and perpetuated by many other military historians who reported on this battle.